The Last Sunset of Madrid. Chapter 1. The Shadows of War. The summer of 1936 had arrived like every other in Spain, hot, dry, and sluggish, but this time, something felt amiss. The country was teetering on the brink of destruction. The scent of orange blossoms that typically filled the air was now tainted by the unmistakable stench of fear. In the capital, Madrid, the simmering tensions between political factions reached a boiling point, and what was once a fractured society was now a nation on the verge of civil war. Alejandro Morales, a 62-year-old retired professor, sat in his modest apartment on a balcony overlooking the city. The morning sun had barely kissed the earth when his trembling hands picked up the newspaper. Its headlines were no longer concerned with academic pursuits or political rhetoric, but screamed of a deeper divide: Republicans and Nationalists. This was the birth of the Spanish Civil War, a brutal conflict that would ravage the country for years. As Alejandro read, he couldn't help but hear the distant echoes of gunfire, sporadic at first, but soon forming a steady rhythm, like the pulse of a city in turmoil. His wife, Isabel, stood behind him, her thin figure draped in a faded shawl. She wasn't a woman of many words, but when she spoke, it was always with a quiet wisdom born from years of hardship. "It is happening, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alejandro's eyes remained fixed on the page as his heart sank.
Yes.
Spain is burning. Outside their apartment, Madrid seemed to come alive with the sounds of revolution, the chaos of a nation at war. Alejandro had once believed in the power of reason and debate, but now, as the barricades rose and the city fractured, words seemed irrelevant in the face of such overwhelming destruction. Chapter 2. A City in Flames. In the weeks following the outbreak of war, Madrid transformed before Alejandro's eyes. Once vibrant and lively plazas stood eerily silent, their cobblestones stained by the blood of the fallen. The city that had once welcomed intellectuals and artists with open arms now held nothing but death and despair. Churches were burned, bookstores looted, and families, once whole, disappeared overnight. Walls were plastered with revolutionary slogans that had replaced the old advertisements of modern life. Alejandro and Isabel were caught in the crossfire, mere bystanders in a war that tore through the very fabric of their existence. Alejandro's former students, young men and women who had once sat in his classroom, now marched in opposing armies. Some stood with the Republicans, fueled by the ideals of democracy and social justice, while others joined Franco's Nationalists, drawn by a vision of a militarized Spain and a desire to end the chaos. In the midst of the fighting, friendships were severed, and even families were divided over political allegiances. One night, as the air grew thick with the tension of an impending storm, there came a loud knock at the door. Alejandro's heart skipped a beat. He had long known that the conflict would find its way to his doorstep, but he had hoped for just a little more time. He opened the door to find a young man, no more than 20, standing in front of him. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, and he held a rifle in his hands. He looked out of breath, as though he had run through the streets of Madrid to get there. His eyes were wide with fear, and his voice trembled as he spoke. "Professor Morales," the boy gasped. "They're coming for intellectuals. You must leave, now." Alejandro stared at him, unsure of what to say. He had long suspected that the regime would target intellectuals, professors, and artists, those who were seen as threats to the ideological purity of the opposing factions. But the reality of the situation had finally caught up with him. Isabel stepped forward, her frail hands clutching the edge of her shawl as she glanced nervously at the door. "We can't run. We're too old." "It's too late," she said, her voice steady but laced with despair. The young man swallowed hard. "Then hide."
Please.
"They took Professor Garcia yesterday. They shot him in front of the university." Alejandro's breath caught in his throat. Professor Garcia had been a close friend, a colleague with whom he had spent years shaping the minds of Spain's youth. To hear that he had been executed in cold blood was both a personal loss and a harsh reminder of how far the nation had fallen. In the space of mere days, Their once beloved Spain had become a battlefield where the old rules no longer applied. "Please, Professor," the young man pleaded. "They'll come for you next." Alejandro's eyes filled with tears as he turned to look at Isabel. They had lived through so much together, but now, as the war raged on, they had to make a decision: to run or to stay and face the consequences of their convictions. The young man's words rang in Alejandro's ears. "You cannot hide from this storm forever." But was it even possible to escape? As the walls of Madrid closed in around them, Alejandro and Isabel had no choice but to decide their next move. Would they join the mass exodus of intellectuals fleeing the city, or would they stay and fight for a country that had become a shadow of its former self? The choice seemed impossible, but the reality of their circumstances loomed large. They were not just battling against an invading army, but against the collapse of everything they had once held dear: a way of life, a sense of belonging, and an identity as Spaniards who had believed in the possibility of a better future. The hours that followed were filled with fear and confusion. Alejandro felt like he was standing at the crossroads of history, but he could not see which path would lead him home. What remained of his beloved Spain? Would they live to see the city's last sunset? Or would they become the next victims of a war that seemed to have no end? As the flames of war continued to consume Madrid, Alejandro and Isabel made a silent pact to survive, no matter the cost. They would cling to each other in the face of unimaginable loss, and in the heart of the madness, they would hold on to the belief that there was still something worth saving. The city was burning, but they had yet to make their choice. The last sunset of Madrid. The shadows of war. The summer of 1936 arrived in Spain with the same scorching heat as any other year. Yet this time there was something different in the air, something thick, heavy, and unrelenting. The wind that once carried the scent of orange blossoms and warm earth now carried something darker: the whisper of revolution, the distant thunder of marching boots, and the smell of smoke and gunpowder. For Alejandro Morales, a 62-year-old retired professor of literature, these were not mere signs of unrest. They were the echoes of a storm that had been brewing for years. Sitting on the balcony of his modest Madrid apartment, he held his morning newspaper with trembling hands. The inked letters seemed to scream at him, words that foretold the destruction of his homeland. Madrid under siege. Republicans call for resistance. Nationalist forces march toward the capital. From his perch, Alejandro could hear the distant popping of gunfire, faint at first, but soon growing into a steady, menacing rhythm. Behind him, his wife, Isabel, stood wrapped in her worn shawl, her aged hands clasped together. Her eyes, once bright with youth, now carried the weight of uncertainty. "It's happening, isn't it?" she whispered. Alejandro swallowed hard. "Yes," he said, his voice barely more than a breath. "Spain is burning. A city in flames." Madrid was no longer the city Alejandro had known. In mere days, the streets transformed into battlefields. Where once children played, now young men and women, many of them his former students, stood armed with rifles, their faces hardened by fear and determination. Buildings that had stood for centuries now bore the scars of war: bullet holes, shattered windows, crumbling facades. Churches burned, their bells silenced. Libraries were looted, their precious books tossed into the flames. Families disappeared overnight, dragged from their homes under accusations of being traitors or sympathizers. Alejandro had always believed that words held power, that reason could resolve any conflict. But in the streets of Madrid, words had lost their strength. Bullets spoke louder. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the city's skyline, a knock echoed through their apartment. Alejandro hesitated before opening the door. Standing there was Miguel, a boy of barely 20, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He held a rifle, though his hands trembled around it. "Professor Morales," Miguel gasped, his voice thick with urgency. "They're coming for intellectuals. You have to leave, now." Isabel's grip tightened around Alejandro's arm. "We can't run," she whispered. "We're too old." Miguel shook his head, his eyes filled with desperation. "Then hide."
Please.
They took Professor Garcia yesterday. They shot him in front of the university. Alejandro's breath caught in his throat. Garcia, his colleague, his friend, dead. Executed. For the first time in his life, Alejandro felt truly powerless. The resistance. Running was not an option. Alejandro knew he could never hold a rifle, never march into battle. But there were other ways to resist. He began his fight in the basement of their building, where he gathered books, precious books. Many were banned, deemed too dangerous for the new Spain. He collected volumes of Cervantes, Lorca, and Unamuno, writers whose words had built the soul of Spain long before war came to destroy it. Every night, by the flickering glow of a single candle, Alejandro taught in secret. His students, those who had once sat in his lecture halls, now came to him in whispers and shadows, eager to remember a Spain that existed before the war. They read poetry by moonlight. They spoke of philosophy in hushed voices. They defied the war by refusing to forget. But resistance was dangerous. One evening, as Alejandro returned home from one of these underground lessons, he found Isabel waiting at the door, her face pale. "They took Miguel," she said. Alejandro's chest tightened. Miguel, the boy who had warned them. The boy with fire in his heart and fear in his eyes. He had been captured by nationalist forces. He would be executed at dawn. The price of hope. Madrid had become a ghost town. Its streets were lined with bullet-ridden buildings and abandoned corpses, bodies of men and women who had dared to hope, to resist. Under the cover of darkness, Alejandro made his way through the ruined city, his heart pounding. He had no weapons, no plan, only desperation and a lifetime of convictions. At the detention center, he found Miguel bound and beaten, his face swollen, his shirt stained with blood. With what little influence he had left, Alejandro begged for Miguel's life. "He's just a boy," he pleaded. "He has no politics, only dreams." The nationalist captain sneered. "Dreams mean nothing in war." Before Alejandro could respond, a deafening explosion shook the ground beneath them, a Republican attack. In the chaos, Alejandro grabbed Miguel and ran. They didn't stop until they reached the outskirts of Madrid, where a group of Republican resistance fighters took them in. Alejandro had won Miguel's life, but at what cost? The last sunset. Years passed. The war ended, but Spain remained scarred. Alejandro, now older and weaker, sat once more on his balcony, watching the sunset bathe Madrid in hues of red and gold. Beside him sat Miguel, no longer a boy, but a man hardened by war. "Was it worth it?" Miguel asked. "All that we lost." Alejandro didn't answer at first. He thought of Garcia, of the students who never returned, of the books hidden beneath the floorboards. He thought of the whispers in the basement, the words spoken in defiance of destruction. Finally, he smiled faintly. "As long as Spain remembers," he said, "it was worth it." As night fell over Madrid, Alejandro closed his eyes, knowing that though war had silenced many voices, it had not silenced the truth. Final thoughts. The echoes of war. The Spanish Civil War was more than a battle of ideologies. It was a war that tore families apart, destroyed entire cities, and left scars that still linger today. For those who lived through it, it was not just about soldiers and politics. It was about survival, sacrifice, and the fight to keep history alive. Though Alejandro's story is fictional, it is inspired by countless real intellectuals, teachers, and everyday citizens who resisted in their own ways. Their struggle ensured that the lessons of the past would never be forgotten. The last sunset of Madrid may have faded, but its memory lives on. If you liked this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and become a part of our community. Here, you'll find historical wars, inspiring stories, and unique content based on real events. If you want to see more engaging and fact-based stories, hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest videos instantly. Your support means the world to us. Leave a comment and let us know what topics you'd like us to cover next. Raising hands fire. Bell subscribe, share, and help us bring these incredible stories to the world.